Code Explained says hi. Today we're going to create a to-do list using JavaScript. This is the interface of our to-do list. Now I will go and add a to-do to our list, saying drink coffee. I need to hit enter, play, enter, and then, for example, shower, enter. Now if the first to-do is completed, I'll go and click this button. Now it is checked, which means it is completed. Let's go and say I want to get rid of this item. I will go and click the trash button. Now if I refresh the page, the list is still there because it is saved to our local storage. If I want to uncheck the first one, I will just click this button again. Now to get rid or to clear the list, I will go and click this button. So let's go and create this. Like always, we're not going directly to open our text editors. Instead, we're going to see the logic behind every piece of the code, and then we can type in the code. So let's start with the HTML part. In the HTML part, we have here a container. Inside there is the header and the content. Inside the content we have our list, and then the add item dev or the input. Inside the header we have the clear button to clear the local storage, and also we have the date block which will show today's date. Then inside our list we have our item. Our item here has three contents. First is the button check, then the text, and then the trash button. For our add item here we have a plus icon, then an input with the text type and the ID input, and a placeholder that says add a to-do. Now this is the whole HTML file. We still need to link our CSS files and the JavaScript. At the top, inside our head, we're going to link the font from Google and the font awesome for the icons and our own style.css file. And at the bottom, before the closing body tag, we're going to link our script. Let's now move to the JavaScript part. The first thing we're going to do is to select our elements. We're going to need to select the clear button using query selector. The query selector here select the first item with this class name. For us, our document has only one item with the class.clear. And then we need to select the date element using the getElementById, which takes in the ID of the element. Then we need to select our list and also the input, so we can get the value the user enter in this field. Please don't forget to subscribe. Let's talk about insertadjacentHtml. As you saw before, we need to add new items to our list and keep in the old ones. So we'll need for that a method called insertadjacentHtml. So what this method does, let's say this is our page, and then we have here an item with the ID element, and inside we have some content, for example the first child and then the last child, and inside we have other elements. This is the beginning of our element, or the start. This is the end of our element, right? Now we need first to select our element using, for example, getElementById. The syntax of insertadjacentHtml is this. you need to say element.insertadjacentHtml, our method, which takes in two arguments. The first one is the position of the thing we are adding to our element. So the position might be before begin, before the begin, or after begin, before end, or after end. And the second parameter or argument is text, which could be something. For example, if we say before begin, the text or something will be placed right before our element. And if we say after begin, it will be right after or the beginning of our element, which means before the first child. If we say before end, it will be placed right before the end, which means after the last child inside our element. And if we say after end, our something will be placed outside the element and after the end. So you may think why we just don't use inner HTML. If we use inner HTML, this will override all or everything inside our element. Now, let's talk about how to add a toDo to our list. You still remember that we selected our list element using this line of code. Now we're going to say list.insertadjacentHtml, which takes in the position and the text. The text here is our item, or is the toDo. So we're going to create a constant called text equal to our item HTML code. This is the button for the complete. I added an attribute called job equals complete. Then the text itself, it says drink coffee. And last, the trash button. I added an attribute called job equals to delete. And then I will put this inside the backtick or grave accent, or I'm using here the template literal. Now we need another constant, which is the position, and I will use here before end. So every new item will be placed at the end or just after the last child. Then I will put all this code inside the function called toDo, as we are going to use or to reuse this code again and again. Our function will take in a parameter called toDo, which I'll place here using a placeholder. So there is a $sign and the curly brackets and then our parameter. Now if I say toDo and pass drink coffee string to it, I will add a new item to the list successfully. Now when the user type in a toDo, he must also press enter to add it to the list. So how do we know that the user pressed the key on the keyboard? So we will need to add an event listener to our document, which is a key up. So whenever the user press a key, this function here will fire up. This function will take an event. Now every key on the keyboard has a key code. For example, the enter key has a key code which is 13. Now I will just say if the event.key code is 13, then we know for sure that the user pressed the enter key. Now if it's true, we will get the value of the input. So we will create a constant called toDo equals input.value. If you remember, we selected our input field using this line of code. So now we need to check if the input isn't empty, if the user really filled the input or not. So we'll say if toDo. Now if the string toDo here is empty, it will return false, which means we won't run the code inside the if statement. And then inside our if statement, we will call the function toDo. So we'll say add toDo, and we pass in our toDo variable or string. The last thing we need to do is to make the input empty. So we need to say input.value equals an empty string. The problem here is that this code will only show this to the user interface. We also need to store a toDo. So to store a toDo, we will need to create a variable called list, which is an array which has inside objects. For example, our first item will have the ID 0. This is its name, drink coffee, its ID 0, done set to false, and trash set to false. This is another item, and this is what we will show to the user interface. I created a new variable here, which is the ID, and I set it to 0. Why? Because every time we add a new item to the list, we need to increment the ID by 1. Done. What do we mean by done? If you can see here, the done here is set to false, and here done is set to true. Done means completed. If the item here or the toDo is completed, we set this to true, like this. And if it's not, if it's false, means this one here is not completed. The same thing for the trash property. The trash property here is set to false, which means that this item here, it's not removed, it's still there. Now let's update our latest code. It is looking like this so far. Now our function add toDo here is taking only one variable, which is toDo. Now we need to add all the other properties, the ID, and then done and trash. We set them to false by default, because when the user add a new toDo to the list, automatically the done and trash are set to false, because the toDo is not completed yet and it's not in the trash yet. Now we need to add this to our list variable, and we will use for that the push method. We will push to our list a new object with these properties. The name is our toDo here. The ID is this ID here. If it's the first time the user is adding an item to the list, the ID here will be set to 0. Then the done is set to false, and the trash is also set to false. Remember, after adding an item, we need to increment the ID by 1. So this is what ID++ will do. Again, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's update our function toDo, or add toDo. This our function is looking like this so far. Now there's other parameters that we need to take in mind. First, you could see here that this icon and this one are different. They are different because they have different class names. This is the class name for this one, and this is the class name for this one. Also, this text here has not a line through, but this one does. So this text here has another class name, which is line through. This class name here, CSS, lives inside our style.css file. Now we need to create some constant for these class names so we can work with them easily. So I'm going to create a constant called check, which will take in this class name. One for uncheck, another one for line through. Now our function here add toDo will get as a parameter an ID. This ID will go here. So the first button here, which has the check button, which has a job complete, will have this ID here. If it's 0, this one will have the ID 0, and also the delete button will have the same ID. The next parameter or argument is done. When done is set to false, we need to show this icon, which means we will use this class name, means this variable or this constant. If it is set to true, we will use this icon, which means we will use this class name which means we'll use this check constant. So I will need here an if statement to check if done is set to true or false, and then take the decision whether use the check or the uncheck class name. So I'm gonna say, or I'm gonna create a new constant called done equals. So if done here is set to true, then we will use the check class name. Otherwise, we'll use the uncheck class name. Also, I will create a new constant called line. If done here is true, which means it is checked, we will need to add a line through the text. So I will add a line through. If it's false, I will use an empty string. Then I will add this done and line constant. The done constant will be here, and the line will be here for the text. Now the last argument is trash. So I will say if trash. So if the item is in the trash, which means it is set to true, we don't need to run this code. We won't need to show anything to the user because the item is removed. So I will run return. So after return, inside the function, no matter what code is after that return, it won't be run. If trash is set to false, there is no return, so we will run this code. Now let's talk about what will happen when a toDo is done. Before a toDo is done, our button here has this class name. If the user clicks on this button, we need to remove this class name and then add the class name for this icon. Also, there is the possibility for the user to undone a toDo. So if the user clicks on this button which has this class name, we need to remove this class name and then add the class name for this icon. So how do we do that using code? When the user, for example, clicks on this element, we need to set or to select that element and then use class list, which will return the class names of this element. Now we need to decide if the class exists, we need to remove that class. Otherwise, if that class doesn't exist in the class list, we need to add that class to the class list. To do this, we will need to use the toggle method. Toggle will check if the class exists, it will remove it. If it's not, it will add it to the class list. Now, we will create a function called completeToDo. This completeToDo function will be run whenever the user clicks on these buttons. This function here would take as a parameter the element. Then we will say element.classList.toggle check. So if the check is in the class list, we will remove it. Otherwise, we will add it to the class list. Also, we will need to remove the uncheck if it's in the class list. Otherwise, add it to the class list. So this two line of code will do one thing. If check is in the class list, we will remove it and add the uncheck. Otherwise, if the uncheck is in the class list, we'll remove it and add the check class to the class list. Now we need to add a line through this text, but we first need to select this text on this element, because this element here, the one we selected here, is this button. To select this text, we need first to go to the parent element and then select the text element using query selector, and then use the class list and then toggle the line through. Now we need to update our list variable, because 3 lines of code will just update the user's interface. We also need to update our list variable. Before updating our list variable, we must first know which item we are dealing with. So I will say element.id to get the ID of this button, for example, and then use list with index of that ID, and then access the property done. If you don't remember, this is, for example, the list with the index 0. This is item, or this is the first item. The property we want to change or to update is the done property. So we'll see if done here is set to true, we need to change it to false. Otherwise, if it's false, we need to change it to true. So I'm gonna say if this one here is true, I will set it to false. If it's false, I will set it to true. And then update our done property of the right to do. Let's now talk about how to remove a to do. This is, for example, our to do. When the user clicks on this button, we should remove all this block. If the user clicks on this one, we need to select this element. Now, the element we want to remove, it's not this element here. We need to remove this whole element, which is the element that parent node. And to remove this element here, we need to get to its parent element, which means we'll say element that parent node, Then we will use the remove child method and pass in the element that parent node. We put this inside the function called remove to do, which takes in the element as a parameter. Remember, this will remove the element just from the user interface. We also need to update our list variable. So I'm going to say list, the element ID, then dot trash, this is the property, equals true. So we'll set the trash to true, which means the element or the to-do is removed. Now our elements here, or our items, are created dynamically. So we can't add an event listener to these buttons, for example. So the solution here is we need to select the parent element, which is the list. So we already select this list element. Then we need here to add an event listener to that element, which will be the click event. And after a click event, we will run a function which will take an event as a parameter. And then we will say event.target. This will return the element we clicked. Every element we clicked inside our list element. So this, for example, if I click this button here, this trash button or this delete button, it will return this line of code. This trash button here has an ID which is 0. The job attribute is delete. I will set this to a variable called element, so I can use this for later. Now when I click on this button or this one, they both have the same ID. So we need to check, or we need to know what is their job attribute value. So I will say event.target.attributes.job.value. This will return either delete or complete. I will set this a constant called element job. Now I will just use an if statement. So I will say if element job is complete or is delete. If it's complete, I will run the function complete to do, which will take in the element variable. And if it's delete, I will run the function remove to do, which will take in the element variable too. Again, don't forget to subscribe. Now, we need to save our to-do list to the local storage. In general, to save a value to a local storage, we will say local storage, that's the item, then we give the key and the value we want to store. Now to get the item, I will say local storage.getItem of the key, and I will set this to a variable for later use. In our case, we will say local storage.setItem. I will give the key this name to do, and then our list. Our list here is a variable, so I'm gonna use JSON.stringify method. Now the question is where to put this line of code. The answer is inside our code. whenever we update our list array, just after it we will add this line of code. Now we need to restore the to-do list. So to restore, we will use the get item and our key, which is toDo. We set this to a variable called data. We need to check if there is data. What do we mean? When our user opens our to-do list application for the first time, there is nothing in the local storage, which means the data is empty. If data is empty, we need to create a list array and set the ID to 0. Remember, we need to define our list and ID variables outside these blocks. Now, what if there is data? Means this is not the first time our user opens the application. So we will need to get the list. So we will say list equals JSON.parse the data we get from our local storage. And then we will need to load the list to the user interface. For that we will use the function load toDo. And then we need to set the ID equals to list.length. Why? Because we need to set the ID to the last ID in our list variable or array. So for example, if the ID of the last item is 10, for example, if we have 10 items in our list array, then list.length will return 11, which means 11 will be the next toDo ID. Let's talk about our load toDo function. The load toDo function will take in as a parameter an array, which is our list here. Then we need to loop over our array, and we'll use for each, which will run a function that takes in an item from the list or from the array list. Now I will need to show this item to the user, so I'm going to use the add toDo function that takes in the name of the item, its ID, its done property, and the trash property. Now the user might want to clear the storage, so when we click on this button here, which we selected using this line of code, we will clear the local storage and refresh the page. So I will add an event listener to our clear button here, which will fire up a function. This function will clear the storage using the clear method and reload the page. Now we need to show today's date. For that, we already selected our element, so we call this constant date element. So I'm going to say date element dot inner HTML equals today. Today is a variable which is equal to new date object. But to show this date in this format, we should use toLocalDateString method, which will take in two arguments, the language and some options. The options here is an object which has some properties. The weekday, if you want it to be long, like in this case, set it to long or short. The month here is short. The day here is a number. If you want to know more about this toLocalDateString method, you can check this link in the description. Are you ready now to type in the code? Before that, if you are not subscribed, please hit this button and subscribe, and if you are, please hit the bell to get notified about every new video. So let's go. So if you want to follow the tutorial step by step, you will need to go and download the files from our repo on GitHub. You'll find the link in the description. Go to the do list and then download the files. Unzip the file. Now I'm going to open it using brackets. You'll find the index.html, our app.js, the images, the font, the CSS files, including our style.css. Let's now open our index.html. I will give our page a title. Then I will link all the style or the CSS files, including the font from Google. Then our font awesome.css for the icons. Then our own style.css. I will run a live preview of our page. I'm going to create our container inside the header and the content. In the header we have the clear button, which has this class, and the date dev. Now this is our list, which has an ID list, and the our add to do button inside our container. We have an icon, a plus icon at the left, and then the input. The type is text, the ID is input, and the placeholder that says add a to do. Inside our list, I'm going to create an example of our item. This has a job complete and an ID, for example 0. I'm going to add some text like drink coffee. Then our delete button, which has a job attribute, which is delete, and the same ID, which is 0. Now I'm going to add the icon, the circle. If I replace this class with this one and add the line through, I will get a completed to do. Let's remove this. Now nothing is happening because we didn't type in our JavaScript code yet. I'm gonna comment out these lines of code. And now let's go to our app.js. The first thing is to select the elements. I'm going to create a constant clear to select our button clear using query selector. Then the date element, which will show today's date. Then the list where our item lives, and last our input, so we can get what the user typed in the field. Now we need classes names to deal with them easily. So the first one is for the button check, the second is the one for the uncheck button, and the last is the line through. Now let's show today's date. So I'm going to say date element that inner HTML equals today. Today is an object, which is the new date. Then I'm going to use the local date string, which will get in two arguments, the language and some options. The weekday is long and month is short. Then the day is a number. Now I will save this and refresh. Oops, nothing's happened. So I didn't link my script. So I'm gonna add script. Source equals the JS folder, then the app.js. Now I'm gonna refresh, and there it is, today's date. Now I will add a function to do. So I'm gonna say a function add to do, which will take in a variable to do. I'm gonna use insertadjacentHtml You already know why. Then which takes in two parameters, the position, which will be for end, and then the item itself. I'm going to use here two back tips, and I'm gonna just copy this code. I'm gonna change the drink coffee here to our variable toDo. Let's now try our code, add toDo, say drink coffee. Okay, no style. I should now open my console. See. Okay, there's a problem with the HTML code. Okay, here it is, but I have a space up there, so there's still a problem. Now I should go to my index.html. Oh yeah, I didn't comment out the whole code. I'm gonna copy this right here, and this should fix the problem. Now let's go and continue, type in the code. Now let's add an item when the user hit the enter key. So I'm gonna add an event listener to our document, which is an app, which will fire up a function that takes in an argument event. So I'm gonna say if event.keyCode equals 13, which is the code associated with the enter key. Now I'm gonna check if the toDo is not empty, but first I should get the value from our input field. So here, if we are checking if the input isn't empty, now I'm gonna run add toDo function. Now let's go and try that. I'm gonna add for example something. I hit enter and you can see it there, but we still need to clear the input. So I'm gonna say input.value equals an empty string. Let's try that, test, and it worked. Okay, now we need to add some other variables like the ID and done and trash. The ID will go here. Now we need to check if the item isn't in the trash. If it is in the trash, we will say return, which will prevent the code below to run. And then we need to check if the item or the toDo is not completed. If it is complete, we'll use a check class. If it's not, we'll use the uncheck class. Now the same thing for the line through. And then add my constants here. So I'm going to change this class to done, and this one I'm going to add the line. Now let's try this. So I'm going to say add toDo, then coffee with 2e at the end. Let's say true, false for trash. And you can see here that our toDo here is completed. Let's change that to false. Now you can see that it's not completed. Then let's go and change trash to true. Now if I refresh, you can see that there is nothing in our list, which means the toDo is removed. Now we also need to add our items to a variable. So we need to create some variables, the list, an array, and the ID. And we should use the push method to push the values or the item to our list array. And then for done and trash will be false, because the user just entered a new to do, and we should increment the ID for the next item. Let's check that, to do 1. Oh, something happened. There's something wrong. Okay, it says here an undefined. So yeah, our list variable is not defined. So I will need to say here equal to an array, is an array, and initiate this with 0. So let's go and try that again. So I'm going to say to do 1, to do 2, and it's working. I'm going to check now for our list variable, and our items are there. That's good. Now we will need to create a function called complete to do for when the user clicks the complete button. So I'm going to say function complete to do, which will take in the element, the clicked element. So I'm gonna toggle the class check and uncheck, and also the line through, but I still need to go up to the parent node and then use square selector to select the text, and then toggle the line through. And also I will need to update our list array. So I'm gonna set done to false if it was true, and to true if it was false. I will need also to create a remove to do function. So if the user clicked the trash button, I should remove the element or the item from the user interface. So I'm going to say element.parent node, and then use the remove child to remove the parent node. Now I'm going to say list the element.id done or trash and set it to true. Now let's add an event listener to our list to target the items created dynamically. So I'm going to say list.addEvent listener, which is an onClick, which will run a function. It will take in an argument, which is the event. I'm going to say const the element equals event.target. This will return the clicked element inside our list element. Then I will need to get the job attribute of that element. I'm going to say element.attributes.job.value. This will return complete or delete. So I'm going to check if the element job is complete, and if the element job as remove, then I will run complete to do on that element and remove to do. So I will try, I will check if that works. So I'm gonna add test 1, test 2, and test 3. So I'm gonna check this and this. I'm gonna undone, and everything works. Let's check that for the trash button. Oops, the trash button isn't working. Nothing in the console, so what's the problem? Oh yeah, I see it here, remove. I should say delete. Now let's try that again. Add in a test 1, test 2, test 3. Now if I click on the trash button, I can see that we removed the items from the list. Now I'm gonna add a test. If I refresh, it's gone. We should now deal with our local storage. We should now store this informations to our storage. So I'm gonna say I'm gonna need a line to get the item from the local storage, and also before I need to add them to the local storage. For that I will say local storage, that's set item. I'm gonna give it a key, which is to do, and then stringify our list array. This code here must be written everywhere we update our list array. So I'm gonna copy this, go down. So where do we update our list? Yes, here and here. 2 places, just 2. Now let's go and get the item from the local storage. So I'm gonna say local.getItem and the key, which is toDo. Then check if data, our variable here, is not empty, if there is some data in our local storage, or if there is not data in our local storage. So if there is data, I'm gonna parse the data and set it to our list array, and then get the last ID, which is list.length, and then we need to load the list using the function load list, which I will create soon, to load the list to the user interface. But if the data is empty, means this is the first time the user uses our application. Now to load the items, we need to create a function called load list, which will take in an array as a parameter. So I'm going to use the for each or the for loop function, which will take the item from the list and print it or display or show it to the user's interface. Now let's go and try that. I'm gonna add a test 1, test 2, test 3. I will go and refresh the page. They're still there. That's good. Now let's go and remove an item. Refresh. It's updated. And everything works. That's good. Now I will add another one to test more our application. Now if I click the clear button, nothing's happened, so we need to add an event listener to our clear button. So I'm gonna say so to clear the local storage, so I'm gonna say clear that add event listener click, which will run a function, this local storage that clear method, and we need to reload the page. So let's try that. I'm gonna now click and everything is gone. If I refresh, nothing's there. So guys, this is the end of our tutorial. So see you in the next one. And thanks for watching, and like the video and subscribe.